Some say revenge is a dish best served cold. For Serafina Hayes, it wasn't about revenge. It was about acknowledgement. For 5 years, she had been a ghost, erased from the life of the man she married, the father of her children. Now, standing in the cold, marbled hall of the surrogate's court, holding the small hands of her 5-year-old twins, she was facing his other life. The glamorous mistress, Victoria Croft, dripped in diamonds and disdain. The greedy brother Edward circled like a vulture. They expected to inherit an empire. They looked at Serafina and her children as a final, pathetic nuisance to be swatted away. They had no idea the dead can still speak, and that Richard Blackwood's final words were not a whisper, but a thunderclap that would shatter their world. The envelope felt alien in Serafina Hayes's hands. Its thick, cream-coloured cardstock was a relic from a life she no longer lived, a life of corporate dinners and charity galas. Now her hands were more accustomed to the rough texture of dish sponges and the thin paper of overdue bills. The return address was that of a prestigious Manhattan law firm, Sterling Finch and Associates. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She knew with a sinking certainty what it was. Richard was dead. She slit it open with a trembling finger, ignoring the pile of brightly coloured plastic toys on her worn living room rug. Inside, the formal, black-lettered summons confirmed her fears. Richard Blackwood, founder and CEO of Blackwood Innovations, had passed away a week prior in a single-car accident on the Palisades Parkway. And she, Serafina Hayes, was required to attend the reading of his last will and testament. Her name. He had used her name. Not Serafina Blackwood, the name she had proudly taken and later quietly shed, but Serafina Hayes, the name of the woman she had been forced to become again. A single mother of twins, a waitress at a diner in Queens, a ghost haunting the edges of a billionaire's gilded life. 5 years. It had been 5 years since she had last seen him in person. The memory was seared into her mind like a brand. She was 3 months pregnant, her belly just beginning to show the gentle swell of the new life, the lives within her. He had come home to their brownstone, his face a mask of cold resolution she had never seen before. He told her about Victoria Croft, a younger, more ambitious woman who better fit the new life his exploding tech fortune afforded him. "It's over, Sarah," he'd said, his voice devoid of the warmth she had once cherished. "She understands my world. This domestic life. It's not for me anymore. Not now." She had begged. She had pleaded. She had told him about the baby. He had simply stared at the space above her head. "I'll have my lawyer arrange a settlement," was his only reply. "Be reasonable. Don't make this messy." The settlement came. A one-time payment that felt more like hush money than support. It was enough to get her a small apartment in a walk-up building and cover the hospital bills when Noah and Chloe made their dramatic early entrance into the world. After that, there was nothing. No calls, no visits, no acknowledgement that his own flesh and blood existed. She had been erased. The world knew Richard Blackwood as a brilliant, trail-blazing bachelor with the stunning socialite Victoria Croft on his arm. Serafina and the twins were a secret he had buried deep. Now he was dead, and he was summoning her from the grave. "Mommy, are you sad?" a small voice asked. Chloe, her daughter, stood beside her, her big blue eyes. Richard's eyes filled with concern. Noah, ever his sister's shadow, peeked out from behind the worn armchair, clutching a half-eaten apple. Serafina forced a smile, folding the letter and tucking it into her pocket. "No, sweetie. Just thinking." But she was sad, not for the man who had shattered her heart, but for the father her children would never know, and for the man Richard could have been before ambition and wealth had corroded his soul. Why? Why would he summon her now? Was it a final cruel joke, a chance for his mistress and family to formally humiliate her, to state on the record that she and her children were entitled to nothing? The thought sent a jolt of bitter anger through her. Edward Richards' younger brother had always despised her, seeing her as a gold digger who wasn't from their elite social circle. And Victoria, Serafina had only seen photos of her in magazines, a woman who looked like she was sculpted from ice and diamonds. She shouldn't go. It would be a circus. She would be a lamb to the slaughter. But then she looked at her children. They were Richard's children. They had his sharp intelligence, his determined chin, his startlingly blue eyes. They were a living, breathing part of him, and he had denied them their entire lives. Maybe this wasn't about her. Maybe it wasn't about money or revenge. Maybe it was about them. About standing in that room in front of all the people who had pretended they didn't exist and showing them that they did. It was about claiming their identity, not their inheritance. "Noah, Chloe, come here," she said, her voice finding a new strength. The twins scurried over and she knelt, pulling them into a tight hug. "We have to go on a little trip next week, to a big fancy building in the city. You have to be on your very best behavior. Can you do that for Mommy?" They both nodded solemnly, their small faces serious. That night, after she put the twins to bed, Serafina pulled out an old photo album. There she was with Richard in the early days, before Blackwood Innovations had become a titan of the industry. He was a brilliant driven programmer with a wild dream. She was a graphic designer who believed in him. They had built the company's first logo together in their tiny apartment, surviving on takeout, and shared hope. He was smiling in every picture, his arm wrapped tightly around her. That was the man she had loved, the man who had promised her forever. She closed the album, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. That man was long dead. This summons was from the stranger he had become. She would go. She would wear her best, albeit second-hand dress. She would hold her head high. She would walk into that courtroom, not as a victim, but as a mother. She owed her children that much. She would face the viper's den for them. Whatever a hostile world and Richard's will had in store for her, she would not flinch. The penthouse apartment atop the Blackwood Tower was a monument to new money and curated perfection. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a god's-eye view of Central Park, the autumn foliage, a carpet of crimson and gold. Inside the decor was a severe palette of chrome glass and white leather, punctuated by abstract art that cost more than the average American home. This was Victoria Croft's kingdom, and for the past week she had been its grieving queen. Her grief, however, was a performance. It was expertly crafted, displayed in tasteful black silk ensembles from Chanel and somber reflective posts on her influential social media accounts. She mourned Richard Blackwood not as a lost love, but as a lost investment. For 5 years she had been his partner, his muse, his public face. She had tolerated his workaholic tendencies, his emotional distance, and his lingering mentions of a mistake from his past. She had played her part perfectly, and now was the time for her reward. The will reading was a mere formality, the final legal step in her accession to the throne. "More champagne, Vicky." Edward Blackwood slouched on the white leather sofa, swirling a flute of Dom Perignon. He was Richard's younger brother by 2 years, a man who possessed all of Richard's ambition, but none of his genius or work ethic. He had a soft, entitled look, his face perpetually arranged in a smug smirk. He saw Richard's death not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. "It's not even noon, Edward. Victoria replied, though she held out her glass for a refill. "But I suppose we have cause to celebrate." "To the future," Edward toasted, his eyes glinting. "The future of Blackwood Innovations. Our future." They had made a pact in the hushed, frantic days following Richard's accident. Victoria would inherit the controlling shares, as she was certain Richard had promised. She, in turn, would install Edward as CEO, a position he'd always coveted, and Richard had always denied him. Together, they would run the empire. Victoria would handle the public relations, the glamour, the lifestyle branding. Edward would handle the boring corporate side of things. It was a perfect symbiosis of vanity and greed. "I still can't believe Walter Sterling insisted on a formal reading at the courthouse," Victoria complained, dabbing her lips with a napkin. "It's so theatrical, so public. Richard hated that kind of spectacle." "Sterling is an old dinosaur," Edward scoffed. "He was our father's lawyer. Richard only kept him on out of some misplaced sense of loyalty. The man still uses a fountain pen. Don't worry about him. He'll read the paper, declare you the new Queen of New York, and we can get on with liquidating some of the less profitable assets." A thought then darkened Victoria's perfectly sculpted features. "Speaking of dinosaurs, Sterling's office called this morning. They said she's confirmed she will be attending." Edward sat up, his smirk faltering for a moment. "You mean Serafina?" He said the name as if it were a foul taste in his mouth. "The one and only, the little brown mouse from Queens." Victoria's voice was laced with venom. Can you imagine the nerve after all these years? What could she possibly hope to gain by crawling out of the woodwork now? Attention, a pathetic grasp for a final handout, Edward sneered, recovering his composure. "Let her come. It will be amusing. The press will be there. Let them see the contrast. You, the grieving, elegant partner, and her, whatever she looks like now, a frumpy, forgotten relic. It only solidifies your position as Richard's true choice." Victoria smiled, the image pleasing her. She had built her entire identity around being the woman who had won Richard Blackwood. Serafina was a footnote, a mistake Richard had corrected. Her presence would be an ugly, inconvenient truth, but one that would ultimately highlight Victoria's own brilliance and superiority. "And she's bringing the children," Victoria added, a fresh wave of disgust in her tone. Edward waved a dismissive hand. "Irrelevant. Richard never acknowledged them. Legally, they don't exist in his world. They are her baggage, not his." Despite their outward confidence, the mention of Serafina and the twins was a tiny splinter of irritation under their skin. They were a loose end, a chapter Richard had never fully closed. Both Victoria and Edward had on separate occasions tried to press Richard about the legal status of his first marriage. He had always been evasive, cutting the conversation short with a sharp, "It's handled." They assumed he had secured a quiet divorce and a binding non-disclosure agreement. They had to assume that. The alternative was too inconvenient to consider. "Well," Victoria said, standing up and walking towards the window, her silk robe flowing behind her. "Let her have her little day in court. It will be the last time anyone ever hears the name Serafina Hayes in connection with the Blackwood family." She looked down at the city sprawling beneath her, a kingdom she was moments away from officially claiming. After tomorrow, she'll just be a waitress again, and we will be everything. Edward joined her at the window, placing a hand on her shoulder in a gesture that was meant to be supportive, but was possessively proprietary. "Everything," he echoed. They stood there, two predators surveying their domain, utterly confident in their victory. They were cocooned in a world of wealth and privilege, a world where inconvenient people like Serafina Hayes and her children could be easily dismissed, ignored and forgotten. They had no inkling that the foundation of their gilded cage was built on secrets and regrets, and that the man who built it had left behind a key designed to tear it all down. The storm was coming, and they were blissfully, arrogantly unaware, sipping champagne in the heart of the hurricane. The surrogate's courtroom was an imposing chamber of dark wood, soaring ceilings, and hushed solemnity. It smelled of old paper and furniture polish, a scent that seemed to absorb sound and emotion. For Serafina, it felt like a cathedral dedicated to endings. She sat on a hard wooden bench, her back ramrod straight. Noah was on her right, Chloe on her left, their small legs dangling far above the floor. She had dressed them in their nicest clothes, a small collared shirt for Noah, a simple blue dress for Chloe, both purchased from a consignment shop. She wore a modest navy blue dress, the only one she owned, that didn't have a small stain or a frayed hem. Compared to Victoria Croft, she felt like a sparrow next to a bird of paradise. Victoria sat across the aisle, a vision in a tailored black dress that probably cost more than Serafina's monthly rent. Beside her, Edward Blackwood looked impatient, repeatedly checking his Patek Philippe watch. They had a small entourage of lawyers with them, whispering and shuffling papers. When Serafina had walked in, Victoria's eyes had swept over her and the children with a flicker of utter contempt, before dismissing them completely. Edward had offered a small, cruel smirk. They looked through her, not at her. It was the same painful invisibility she had endured for 5 years now performed live in a courtroom. At the front of the room, a stern-faced woman in judicial robes, Judge Albright took her seat. Beside her sat an elderly man with a shock of white hair and a kind but weary face. This was Walter Sterling, the executor of Richard's estate. He gave Serafina a brief, unreadable glance before adjusting his spectacles and opening a thick, leather-bound portfolio. "We are gathered for the reading of the last will and testament of Mr. Richard Blackwood." Judge Albright announced, her voice echoing slightly in the cavernous room. "Mr. Sterling, you may proceed." Walter Sterling cleared his throat. "Thank you, Your Honor." He looked out over the small assembly. "This document was prepared by me under the direct instruction of Mr. Blackwood and signed by him 6 months prior to his passing. It is his final and definitive statement of his wishes." He began with the preamble, the formal legal language washing over the room. Serafina held her children's hands tighter. Noah was starting to squirm. Chloe was watching the judge with wide, curious eyes. The first bequests were minor and expected. A generous donation to his alma mater, MIT. Another to a foundation promoting STEM education for underprivileged youth. Victoria nodded approvingly at this, as if taking credit for Richard's philanthropy. Edward rolled his eyes, impatient to get to the real money. Then came personal effects. "To my dear friend, Dr. Alan Chen, I leave my collection of vintage watches in gratitude for 20 years of friendship and spirited debate." Sterling read. A man in the back of the courtroom nodded sadly. Serafina felt a pang of nostalgia. She remembered when Richard bought the first of those watches, a vintage Omega, after they sold their first piece of software. They had celebrated with pizza on the floor of their apartment because they hadn't bought a table yet. It felt like a memory from someone else's life. The air in the room grew tense as Sterling turned a page. This was it. The main part of the estate. The company. The fortune. Victoria sat up straighter, her back no longer touching the bench. She subtly smoothed her dress, a gesture of preparation, like an actress waiting for her cue. Edward leaned forward, his boredom replaced by a sharp, hungry anticipation. Serafina braced herself. She expected her name to be absent, for this to be the final confirmation of her erasure. She just had to sit through it, absorb the final blow, and then walk out with her dignity and her children. That was the only victory she could hope for. Next, Mr. Sterling continued, his voice steady and deliberate. We address the assets related to the Blackwood family. He paused, looking directly at Edward. The room was silent, save for the rustle of paper. Victoria held her breath, a faint, triumphant smile playing on her lips. She was next. She was certain of it. The empire was about to be hers. Walter Sterling adjusted his glasses, his gaze lingering on Edward Blackwood for a fraction of a second too long. The silence in the courtroom stretched thick with expectation. To my younger brother, Edward Blackwood. Sterling read his voice, flat and devoid of emotion. I bequeath my collection of classic cars, including the 1967 Aston Martin DB&S we both admired. Edward's chest puffed out slightly. It was a start, a nice multi-million-dollar toy collection. Furthermore, Sterling continued, I have established a trust in his name. The total sum of this trust is to be $100,000. The words hung in the air. Adaho, $100,000, to the brother of a man worth billions. It wasn't a bequest. It was an insult. A calculated public slap in the face. Edward's smug expression dissolved into disbelief, then into a dark flush of rage. 100,000, he sputtered, half rising from his seat. That's a typo. It must be 100 million. He meant 100 million. One of his lawyers put a restraining hand on his arm, whispering urgently in his ear. Victoria shot him a furious glare, silently commanding him to be quiet. Her perfect composure was cracking. This was not part of the script. Mr. Blackwood, please be seated. Judge Albright warned, her voice sharp as steel. Or I will have you removed. Edward sank back onto the bench, his face a thunderous mask of fury. He looked at Sterling as if the old lawyer had personally betrayed him. But Sterling wasn't finished. He turned the page and continued reading in the same measured tone. This bequest is made with a specific understanding, which my brother knows well. Throughout our lives, I have provided him with opportunities, bailed him out of financial misadventures, and offered him senior positions within my company, which he proved incapable of holding responsibly. This final sum is not a reflection of a lack of affection, but rather a final attempt to impart the lesson I failed to teach him in life, that a man's worth is built, not inherited. I hope this sum, which is more than our father left either of us, will provide him a new start to build something of his own. The humiliation was absolute. Richard had not only disinherited his brother, but he had also provided a public, posthumous character assessment that painted Edward as a feckless, incompetent mooch. Every person in that room, lawyers, reporters, family friends, had just heard it. The colour drained from Edward's face, replaced by a pasty, sickly white. He was ruined, not just financially, but socially. He stared blankly ahead, seeing the smirks he would have to endure at the country club, the whispers at board meetings he would no longer be a part of. Serafina watched, stunned. She had always known Richard felt burdened by his brother, but she never imagined he would be so ruthless. It was a side of Richard she recognized, the same cold, calculating precision he had used to cut her out of his life, now wielded against his own family. Victoria, after her initial shock, seemed to recover. Her expression hardened, with Edward effectively removed from the equation that meant more for her. The entire pie was now hers. She shot a look of pure loathing at the broken man beside her, already discarding him as dead weight. Her focus shifted back to Walter Sterling, her eyes narrowed with renewed, even more intense greed. Now, Sterling said, his voice drawing everyone's attention back to the will. Regarding Ms. Victoria Croft. Victoria's posture became regal. This was her moment. The unpleasantness with Edward was over. She subtly pushed her shoulders back, tilted her chin up, ready to be crowned. Her lawyer gave her a confident nod. "To Ms. Victoria Croft," Sterling began, "with whom I spent the last 5 years of my life, I leave the following." He paused, and the entire room leaned in. Serafina felt her stomach clench. This was it. The part where the mistress who had destroyed her family was handed everything her children should have had. She braced for the pain, for the injustice of it all. "To Ms. Victoria Croft." Walter Sterling repeated his voice, carrying the weight of the moment. "I grant the right to remain in my penthouse residence at the Blackwood Tower for a period not to exceed 12 months from the date of my passing. A year's residency." Victoria's triumphant expression faltered a flicker of confusion in her eyes. It was generous, of course, but it wasn't ownership. It was a lease, a temporary reprieve. Furthermore, Sterling went on his pace, deliberate. During this period, she shall be provided with a monthly stipend of $50,000 for her living expenses. A collective gasp went through the room. $50,000 a month was an immense sum of money, totaling $600,000 for the year. It was a fortune by any normal standard, but for the woman who expected to inherit a multi-billion-dollar empire, it was pocket change. It was a severance package. Victoria was no longer hiding her displeasure. A deep, angry furrow appeared between her perfectly waxed eyebrows. "Is that all?" She hissed her voice, a sharp whisper that still carried through the silent room. "What about the company, the shares he promised me?" "If you would allow me to continue, Miss Croft," Sterling said coolly, not looking up from the document. "These bequests, the residence and the stipend, are contingent upon one single non-negotiable condition." The word condition hung in the air like a guillotine. "Ms. Croft must willingly submit to a full independent forensic audit of all her financial accounts, assets, and communications dating back 5 years. Sterling read, "The purpose of this audit, to be conducted by a firm appointed by the executor of my estate, is to verify that no undue influence, manipulation, or coercion was exerted upon me for financial gain at any point during our relationship." Victoria's face went white. All the color drained from her cheeks, leaving behind a ghastly pallor that stood in stark contrast to her vibrant makeup. "What kind of joke is this?" she demanded, her voice rising in panic. "An audit? That's an outrageous invasion of my privacy. Richard would never—" "He did." Sterling interrupted, his voice firm. He turned a page and continued reading Richard's words. "I make this stipulation with a heavy heart. I came to realize in my final months that my relationship with Miss Croft was not one of equal partnership, but one of transactional convenience, a reality I was too proud and too lonely to admit. I fear her counsel was often guided by avarice rather than affection." Sterling paused, then delivered the final devastating blow. "To aid the auditors, I have submitted a sealed digital file to my executor. This file contains a full recording from a security camera, time-stamped 3 months ago, of a conversation in my home office. During this conversation, Ms. Croft details her demands for a controlling interest in Blackwood Innovations in exchange for her continued companionship, and threatens to fabricate a damaging story to the press should I refuse." A wave of shocked murmurs swept the courtroom. Judge Albright banged her gavel once sharply. Silence. Victoria looked as if she had been struck by lightning. She was hyperventilating, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. The conversation. She remembered it. An argument. She had been furious that he was considering a new R&D project instead of a stock buyback that would inflate the value of the shares she expected to get. She had threatened him. She never in a million years dreamed he was recording it. "This is a lie, a fabrication," she shrieked, finally losing all semblance of composure. "That pathetic, senile old man is making this up. Richard loved me. He would never do this to me. The digital file in question was delivered to this court yesterday. Miss Croft, Judge Albright, said, her voice cold and impassive. Its existence has been verified." Victoria stared at the judge, then at Sterling, her mind racing. An audit would ruin her. It would expose not just her manipulation of Richard, but other, less savoury financial dealings she had engaged in over the years. The recording was a nail in her coffin. She was trapped. Sterling looked directly at her. "The will is quite clear, Miss Croft. Should you refuse the audit or contest this clause in any way, the bequests of the residents and the stipend are immediately rendered null and void. In that event, you will receive nothing. Absolutely nothing." Her entire future was collapsing in on her. The penthouse, the money, the status, all of it was tied to a condition she could never meet. Richard had not just disinherited her. He had laid a perfect, inescapable trap. He had given her a choice between public humiliation followed by nothing or quiet retreat with nothing. Victoria opened her mouth, but no sound came out. A strangled gasp escaped her lips. Her perfectly constructed world had been built on a foundation of lies, and Richard from beyond the grave had just set it on fire. The courtroom was thick with the fallout of the second bombshell. Edward Blackwood sat in a catatonic state of humiliation. Victoria Croft was a statue of silent, screaming shock, her face a mask of utter devastation. Her lawyers were whispering furiously, their confident expressions replaced with panic. All eyes were on Walter Sterling, who seemed impervious to the chaos he had unleashed. He calmly turned the final page of the will. Serafina's heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her ears. She had come here expecting nothing but a final public dismissal. Instead, she had witnessed the complete demolition of the two people who had orchestrated her exile. It was a dizzying, disorienting feeling. But what did it mean, with Edward and Victoria effectively disinherited? Where would the immense Blackwood fortune go? "And now," Sterling announced, his voice drawing every ounce of attention in the room, "we come to the residuary estate. This clause concerns the entirety of the remaining assets, including but not limited to my full and controlling interest in Blackwood Innovations, all real estate holdings, all investment portfolios, and all liquid assets." This was it, the core of the empire. Billions of dollars. Sterling took a deep breath. "I, Richard Blackwood, do hereby declare the following, and ask that it be understood not as a legal maneuver, but as a confession and a profound act of atonement for the greatest failure of my life." Serafina felt a chill run down her spine. Atonement. 5 years ago, driven by fear, weakness, and the blinding glare of sudden success, I abandoned my wife, Serafina Hayes. Sterling read his voice, resonating with a gravity it hadn't held before. The courtroom erupted in gasps. "Wife!" Someone whispered loudly. Victoria's head snapped up, her eyes wide with a new kind of horror. Edward's stupor was broken, his jaw slack with disbelief. They had never divorced. Richard had lied to them all. "My legal marriage to Serafina Hayes was never dissolved." Sterling continued, his voice overriding the noise. "Though we were separated, she remained in the eyes of the law and in the truth of my heart, my wife." Serafina's own hands flew to her mouth. She felt faint. She had assumed the divorce papers he'd had her sign were final. She had never checked. She couldn't afford a lawyer to do so, and she had just wanted the pain to be over. Had he tricked her, or had he never filed them? Sterling's voice cut through her shock. "During our marriage, my wife Serafina conceived our children. I hereby acknowledge with the deepest shame and regret for my years of denial the paternity of our 2 children." He paused, looking directly at Seraphina, his gaze for the first time softening with something akin to sympathy. "Noah Hayes and Chloe Hayes." He said their names. He had written their names. In that moment, it was the only thing that mattered to Seraphina. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring the scene in front of her. Her children, who had been listening with a 5-year-old's confused patience, perked up at the sound of their names. "Therefore," Sterling declared, his voice rising to a climactic finale, "as my lawful and only children, I declare Noah Hayes and Chloe Hayes to be the sole and exclusive heirs to my entire residuary estate." It took a second for the words to register, the full weight of them, sole heirs to everything. The entirety of my controlling interest in Blackwood Innovations, all properties and all financial assets, are to be placed into a secured trust, the Blackwood Children's Trust. Sterling read his voice, booming in the stunned silence. "This trust will be managed for the benefit of my children, to provide for their health education and well-being until they each reach the age of 25, at which point the trust will dissolve, and the assets will be transferred to them in equal shares." Seraphina was sobbing now, silent tears streaming down her face. She pulled her children close, burying her face in their hair. They were safe. Their futures were safe. Richard had done it. In his last act on earth, he had finally done right by them. But the final sentence of the will was the one that shattered the world for everyone else in the room. "As the legal guardian of my children," Sterling read his eyes fixed on Seraphina, "I hereby appoint their mother and my wife, Seraphina Hayes, as the sole trustee of the Blackwood Children's Trust. She will be granted full authority over the trust's management, including full voting rights for all shares within Blackwood Innovations, and complete discretion over the administration of all assets contained within effective immediately." Sole trustee, full authority, full voting rights. He hadn't just given the fortune to his children, he had given the power to control the entire empire to Seraphina, the abandoned wife, the waitress from Queens. That was when the scream came. It wasn't a word. It was a raw, primal sound of pure, unadulterated rage and disbelief, torn from the very depths of Victoria Croft's soul. She launched herself to her feet, her face contorted into a hideous, unrecognizable mask of fury. "No, no, no, it's mine. He promised me that bitch gets nothing. That lying, conniving bitch gets nothing," she shrieked, pointing a trembling, manicured finger at Seraphina. "This is fraud. You will all be hearing from my lawyers. I will burn it all to the ground before I let her have it." The spell was broken. Chaos erupted. Edward was on his feet now, too, shouting about conspiracy, about his brother being mentally incompetent. Reporters in the back were scrambling, trying to get photos of the screaming mistress and the crying, vindicated wife. Judge Albright hammered her gavel repeatedly. "Order, order, in this court officer's escort. Ms. Croft and Mr. Blackwood from the chamber, now." 2 burly court officers moved in, taking a hysterical, flailing Victoria by the arms. She fought, kicked and screamed obscenities, her elegant facade utterly incinerated, revealing the greedy, desperate creature beneath. Edward, looking utterly defeated, allowed himself to be led out without a fight. And through it all, Seraphina sat holding her 2 children, the true heirs, as the world they had been denied came crashing down around them, finally remaking itself in their favor. The chaotic echoes of Victoria's screams and Edward's sputtered threats slowly faded as the heavy courtroom doors swung shut behind them. A profound silence descended, broken only by Seraphina's quiet, cathartic sobs and the gentle rustling of Mr. Sterling's papers as he placed the will back into its portfolio. Seraphina felt a hand on her shoulder. It was her lawyer, Mr. Harrison Finch, a kind public interest attorney she'd found through a legal aid society who had agreed to represent her for a nominal fee. His face, usually etched with weary concern, was split by a grin of absolute astonishment. "Seraphina!" He breathed, his voice filled with awe. "He did it! The absolute madman, he actually did it!" She could only nod, unable to speak, past the lump in her throat. She looked down at Noah and Chloe, who were staring at her with wide, worried eyes, confused by the shouting and their mother's tears. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and gave them a wobbly, watery smile. "It's okay, my loves," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "They're happy tears. Everything is going to be okay now." Judge Albright looked down from her bench, her stern expression softening for the first time that day. "Mrs. Blackwood," she said, her use of the name, a quiet validation that sent a fresh wave of tears down Seraphina's cheeks. "The court recognizes the validity of this will. The probate process will proceed as dictated. My sincerest condolences on your loss and congratulations on your future. This court is adjourned." With a final rap of her gavel, she was gone. The room began to empty, but Seraphina remained seated, feeling as though her legs wouldn't support her. She was a trustee. She had voting rights. She, Seraphina Hayes, the woman who had to choose between paying the electric bill and buying new shoes for her son last month, was now in control of a global technology corporation. The sheer absurdity of it was overwhelming. Walter Sterling approached their bench, his footsteps slow and deliberate on the marble floor. He stopped before them, his old eyes looking not at Seraphina, but at the twins. A faint, sad smile touched his lips. "He had your pictures on his desk," Sterling said, his voice softer now. "The private one in his study at the estate, not the office at the tower. He would look at them when he thought no one was around. He saw you, Mrs. Blackwood, even when you thought he didn't." He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a simple, sealed, white envelope. It was not the thick, intimidating cardstock of the legal summons, but plain personal stationery. Her name was written on the front in Richard's familiar, sharp handwriting. "He asked me to give this to you personally after the reading was complete. He said you would understand everything after reading it." Seraphina took the letter, her fingers trembling. This was more terrifying and more important than the will. The will was about money and power. This was about the truth. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," she managed to say, "for everything." "I was only fulfilling my client's final wishes," the old lawyer said, giving a slight bow. "He was a complicated man, brilliant and deeply flawed. In the end, I believe he tried to be a good one. My firm will be in touch to begin the transfer of power. There is much to do." He gave one last, poignant look at the children. "They are fine children. He would have been proud." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Seraphina, her lawyer, and her two bewildered children alone in the grand, empty courtroom. Later that evening, long after Mr. Finch had escorted them home in a taxi, insisting he pay, and after she had tucked a very confused but happy Noah and Chloe into bed, Seraphina sat in her small, quiet living room. The apartment suddenly felt different. The peeling paint on the window frame, the persistent drip of the kitchen faucet, the threadbare patch on the rug, they were no longer symbols of her struggle, but artifacts of a life she was about to leave behind. With trembling hands, she opened Richard's letter. "My dearest Sarah," it began. "If you are reading this, then it means I never found the courage to say these words to you in person, and for that I am a coward. There is no excuse for what I did to you, for the pain I caused, for the years I lost. I was a fool, blinded by money and fame, and the hollow praise of hollow people. I let men like my brother and women like Victoria convince me that you were a weight, holding me down, when all along you were my anchor. I never filed the divorce papers, Sarah. I told myself it was a legal strategy to avoid splitting the company. But the truth is, I couldn't do it. I couldn't fully sever the one real and good thing in my life. It was my one secret act of defiance against the man I had become. I saw the pictures you posted on a private social media account a friend showed me. I saw my son, my daughter. They are beautiful. They are perfect. And I have been a ghost in their lives. The shame of that is a weight I can no longer carry. This letter. It is a clumsy, inadequate attempt to fix what I broke. I cannot give you back the lost years or undo the heartache, but I can give you and our children a future. I can give you security, and I can give you the power to protect them from the vipers who would have torn it all apart. Don't be afraid of it, Sarah. You were there at the beginning. You believed in Blackwood Innovations when it was just a dream in a garage. In a way, it was always yours. Lead it, remake it, build a better world for our children. You are the smartest, strongest, most decent person I have ever known. You are always too good for me. Forgive me, or don't. You have earned that right. Just know that in the end, after all the noise and the glitter faded, my last thoughts were of you and Noah and Chloe. The family I threw away, and the family I hope, in some small way, I have finally come home to. Yours always, Richard Serafina, folded the letter, pressing it to her heart, as tears of grief, of release, of 1,000 complex emotions washed over her. It wasn't a perfect ending. It couldn't erase the years of hardship and loneliness, but it was a beginning. She walked to the window and looked out at the lights of the city across the river. For the first time in a very long time, they didn't look distant and mocking. They looked like a promise. She was no longer Serafina Hayes, the abandoned wife. She was Serafina Blackwood, the guardian of a legacy, a mother with the power to shape the world for her children. She held her head high, took a deep breath, and prepared to step into her new dawn. The morning after felt strangely unnervingly normal. The sun streamed through the single window of her small Queen's apartment, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. The familiar sound of the radiator hissing filled the silence. For a moment, Serafina could almost believe the events of the previous day had been an elaborate, stress-induced dream. Then she picked up her phone. Her face was everywhere. Grainy photos of her entering the courthouse, her expression a mixture of fear and resolve, were splashed across news websites next to unflattering, wild-eyed images of a screaming Victoria Croft being dragged away. The headlines were sensational. Billionaire's secret family inherits empire? Waitress to CEO, the Blackwood bombshell? Mistress gets nothing in, will-reading shocker. A horde of reporters and news vans were camped on the street below her building, a flock of vultures waiting for a story. The reality of her new life crashed down on her, not as a wave of euphoria, but as a suffocating tide of pressure. She was no longer an anonymous single mother. She was a public figure, a corporate titan by decree, and the guardian of a fortune so vast she couldn't comprehend it. She made breakfast for the twins, her hands moving on autopilot, as she scrambled eggs and poured juice. Noah and Chloe were oblivious, chattering about cartoons, their innocence, a small, precious island in her sea of anxiety. How could she protect them from this? How could she, a woman whose biggest executive decision in the last 5 years was which shift to pick up at the diner, possibly run a multinational technology company, Richard's letter lay on the counter. "Don't be afraid of it, Sarah. You were always too good for me." His faith in her was a comforting warmth, but also a terrifying burden. He saw a queen in the waitress's uniform. She still just saw the waitress. Her old life intruded one last time in the form of a phone call from Maria, her manager at the diner. "Sarah, honey, are you okay? Your picture is all over the news. Is any of this real?" Maria asked, her voice a mix of concern and disbelief. "It's real, Maria," Serafina said, a surreal calmness settling over her. "Oh my God, so I guess you're not coming in for your shift this weekend." Serafina looked at the worn-out, non-slip shoes by her door. "No, Maria. I don't think I will be." After hanging up, a single hysterical laugh escaped her lips. She would never have to smell like fried onions and coffee again. Later that afternoon, a sleek black town car sent by Walter Sterling navigated the media circus and spirited her and the children away to the lawyer's downtown office. The twins were mesmerized by the car's leather seats and bottled water, their excitement a stark contrast to Serafina's churning stomach. Sterling's office was a sanctuary of calm and order. While the twins were entertained by a kind paralegal in an adjoining room, Sterling laid out the reality of the situation for Serafina. "The board of directors is in an uproar," he explained, his steepled fingers hiding none of the gravity of his words. "They are skeptical. They are already preparing a motion to suggest you appoint a proxy, an experienced hand, to manage the trust's voting shares. They mean Edward or someone like him, someone they can control. They want to take it away from me," Serafina said, the statement flat and tired. "They want to sideline you," Sterling corrected gently. "They see a grieving widow, a mother with no corporate experience. They underestimate you, which I believe is precisely what Richard was counting on." He slid a thick binder across the polished mahogany desk. "This is a top-level overview of Blackwood Innovations' current assets holdings and major projects. Richard was not a fool. He knew you would need help. He left a list of trusted advisors, people loyal to him, not to the board. Your first task is to meet with them. But your first decision is what to do about the board." The fear was a cold knot in her stomach. It would be so easy to let someone else handle it, to take the money, hide herself and her children away, and live a quiet life. But that would be betraying Richard's trust. It would be letting the Vipers win. She thought of the logo she had designed all those years ago, the interlocking B and I that she had sketched on a napkin, while Richard excitedly described his vision for the future. She had been a part of this from the very beginning. "Schedule a meeting with the board for tomorrow morning, Mr. Sterling," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "I will address them myself." The next day she walked into the boardroom at the top of the Blackwood Tower. It was a sterile, intimidating space, dominated by a monolithic black table and a panoramic view of the city. A dozen men in identical dark suits, the board of directors fell silent as she entered. Their expressions ranged from pitying to hostile. A man at the head of the table, a steely-eyed executive named Davenport, stood up. "Mrs. Blackwood," he began, his tone oozing condescension. "On behalf of the board, our deepest condolences. We understand this is an overwhelming time. We have prepared a proposal that we feel will honor Richard's wishes while ensuring the continued stability of the company. We suggest the appointment of—" "That won't be necessary, Mr. Davenport," Serafina interrupted. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the air like a razor. Every eye locked on her. She walked to the head of the table to the empty chair that had been Richard's. I have read my husband's will. I have read his letter. And I understand his intentions perfectly. He did not leave me a suggestion. He left me a mandate. I am the sole trustee of the Blackwood Children's Trust, which makes me the majority shareholder of this company. For the foreseeable future, my voice is Richard's voice. She looked each man in the eye. I was with Richard when he wrote the first line of code for what would become this company. I designed the logo on our kitchen table when our only asset was a shared dream. You see a waitress. Richard saw a partner. I suggest you learn to see the same. The discussion is not if I will be leading, but how all of you will be assisting me. Am I understood? A stunned silence filled the room. Davenport's jaw was tight, but he saw the unshakable resolve in her eyes. He saw the ghost of Richard Blackwood's own stubborn determination. He gave a stiff, almost imperceptible nod. Understood. Madam Trustee? Later, Serafina stood alone in Richard's office. It was large and modern, yet filled with personal touches, a shelf of worn science fiction paperbacks, a framed photo of his first programming team, and on the corner of his vast desk, facing his chair, was a small silver frame. In it was a photo she had posted online a year ago. Her and the twins at a pumpkin patch, all three of them laughing, their faces bright with autumn sunshine. He had been watching. He had been with them in his own secret way. The weight of the crown he had placed on her head still felt heavy, but for the first time it didn't feel like it was going to crush her. It felt like home. She sat down in his chair, the leather sighing under her weight, and picked up the phone. Her first call wasn't to a broker or a department head. It was to a real estate agent specializing in high-security family homes. The empire could wait a day. Her children's safety could not. She was a CEO, a trustee, a billionaire. But first and always, she was a mother. And her reign was just beginning. And so Serafina Blackwood's journey took a turn no one could have predicted. She walked out of that courtroom not with revenge in her heart, but with justice for her children held firmly in her hands. The story of the abandoned wife who inherited an empire became a legend, a testament to the fact that truth and integrity can be the most powerful weapons of all. Victoria and Edward faded into obscurity footnotes in a story that was now Serafina's to write. Her path wouldn't be easy. She had a corporate empire to command and 2 children to raise. But for the first time in 5 long years, her future wasn't a struggle for survival, but a landscape of endless possibility. What did you think of this incredible story of justice and vindication? Do you believe Richard's final act was enough to atone for his past? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story moved you, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with someone who loves a story of triumph, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more unforgettable real-life dramas. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. As a more success.